Hi, I'm Janice Trinidad, and I'm going to talk about the Four Tendencies framework and how to connect that to managing people in a project. Just as a recap, at the beginning of the training, we had you take a personality quiz to figure out if you were an upholder, a questioner, an obliger, or rebel. Just to note, if you want to learn more about this, there's a book about it called The Four Tendencies by Gretchen Rubin. If you really like this framework, I suggest you check that out. Also, fair warning, this framework is not your whole personality. It's just the slice of your personality that deals with how you react to expectations. So as a recap, if you're an upholder, if you hear an external or an internal expectations, you readily meet both. If you're a rebel, on the other hand, you tend to resist both inner and outer expectations. Questioners will tend to slow down the flow of expectations because they're going to ask grounding questions. And once they feel like an external expectation makes sense and it's an internal expectation, they're more likely to complete it. And then obligers tend to meet external expectations much better than internal expectations. So this is, again, just the slice about expectations. This says nothing about your moral compass or your work ethic. Anybody in these categories can have high work ethic or low work ethic. This is just dealing with how you react to messaging that deals with expectations. In terms of how this relates to classroom practice, I immediately saw connections because a large part of our job is motivating students to meet expectations. So I'm going to go over some general realizations and then go over a tool I developed that helps students use this knowledge to become better at collaboration. So I had my students take the personality quiz and found that they were represented in all categories. So I knew I had to be mindful about my messaging for all types of expectations, in addition to telling me what tendency their personality more jived with. They also selected quotes from the descriptions that they really were drawn to because they described them well. And then I use that to think about, does this match up with how I think to motivate that student? And sometimes I was correct, and sometimes I was critically wrong. And knowing what they were and what they were drawn to in this framework helped me to reframe expectations in a way for individual students that made it easier for us to develop our relationships. In terms of different ways to motivate people, if I wanted something to really happen, I would represent it in ways that would appeal to all the tendencies. So if something really needed to happen, I would make sure to include clear expectations because upholders like clarity. I would make sure to justify those expectations with why they matter so that it would help the questioners come on board. I would explain how that work impacts other people so that the obligers would know how other people were counting on them to complete the expectation. I would describe the choices that were available to them as they met those expectations, and that would appeal to rebels who like to go their own way. And then for all the students, I would explain the consequences or the impact further on if they didn't meet those expectations. Um, Another aha I had is there are a lot of obligers in my student set. So obligers really like and need external structure in order to meet expectations, things like checklists, deadlines. So I started to value those parts of my project planning more, knowing that students sometimes need those external details in order to get more motivated. Another thing I found really helpful with this strategy is there are resources online, and I'll show you a couple, that help describe what are strengths and weaknesses and strategies that motivate people with these tendencies, and having students look through that enable them to notice things about themselves and their peers that made them a little more effective at collaborating their team, motivating and collaboration. Um, Another big aha, and this is huge, and it helped me develop relationships with some of the students that I sometimes found challenging, is sometimes the students I thought were resisting expectations. It turns out a lot of those students that appear to be resisting expectations weren't rebels, but they were actually questioners who came across as confrontational because they didn't know how to ask their grounding questions in ways that were tact. So once I identified that and knew how difficult it was to ask those questions in a way that didn't sound rude, whenever a student would ask a question that would seem confrontational, like, why are we doing this? What's the point? I would rephrase that question in a way that was a little more specific and that I could answer and sounded a little more polite, and then ask, um, is this what you're trying to clarify? And then I would answer that question. And doing that would also model for those questioners how to ask those questions in a way that was more appealing. And it also helped me to like continue the conversation instead of immediately shutting down if someone said something that I interpreted as rude. The last thing I realized is that this could really be helpful in creating team contracts. So I'm going to show you a sample one that I use with my students that can be used with any project that ties back to the tendencies. So here is the sample contract. You can get your own copy of it at this URL, bit.ly/4T for 4 tendencies contract. And again, here's my name and email in case you have any follow-up questions about this video or the contract. So at my school, our contract has the same 5 headers, but what's inside the headers differ from class to class. So we always have a group info section where we list the student names and how to contact them, their roles, which can vary from class to class. My roles focus on maintaining documents that are important to me during the process of a project. So we have a collaboration manager who's responsible for updating and reminding students about their agreements in the team contract. We have a learning manager who assists the team with setting up their notebooks and keeping their knows and need to knows up to date, and a product manager who's mainly assists the team with interpreting the rubrics and making sure they meet project deadlines. And then the section that I have here that connects to the 4 tendencies is here, norms and strategies. We'll look at that in a second. We also have a protocols section, usually that deals with special cases that occur, like how to deal with absences, and an accountability section, which describes their process for following up with students if things go wrong. So we're gonna look at accountability in a second, but first let's look at this specific section for the 4 tendencies. So in this section, the students would give their name and their 4 tendency, rebel, upholder, questioner, or obliger, and then they would go through this article carefully and read the section that was specific to their tendencies, and it would describe strategies that would help you reach goals depending on your tendency. So they would read each like short description about the tendency, and they would try to pick one that sounded interesting to them or really effective to them. And then they would write the title of that strategy here and then here, and in this bigger box, they would brainstorm what that would look like or sound like in this project. So what I did to help students complete this in a way that was helpful is we had a class discussion about these strategies, and what we did is we made up student names, and then we made up a tendency for them, and then they volunteered a strategy that they were having trouble understanding how it could look in the project. So we made up a student named Sydney who is a rebel, and they wanted to know more about the strategy of identity. The strategy of identity is tying your goals to who you believe you are as a person and your values. So if you want to, rebels have a hard time meeting expectations, but for them, they have an easier time doing things that are deeply intertwined with who they see themselves as people and who they want to be perceived as by other students. So their brainstorming of how they could do that is by giving reminders like cool people achieve, writing affirmations on papers like great work, like I can see you're growing here, I can see you're like a really great student, on their work. Also moral compass reminders say, remember you're doing this because, and then tying it to a value that the student really values. For our next model student that we were discussing, they picked Patrice, and they wanted to discuss strategies that related to questioners. And so one they had trouble understanding is distinctions. The strategy of distinctions points at that different problems require different solutions. And the reasons why questioners like the strategy is they tend to like to customize their approach to solving problems. So once they realized that questioners like to customize things, we started brainstorming ways they can customize their task lists or their goals so that it would be more appealing to someone who is a questioner. So So they have some of those brainstorms here. They could keep a shared list in keep.google.com. We have solving paper that walks them through solutions. They could try to customize that solving paper so it better matches up with the way they approach problems. They could add stars to tasks they want to target that day. They can classify things on their task like it's hard, medium, and easy and decide their order. There's various ways to do that. But the key thing is for a questioner, if the distinction strategy appeals to you, it's giving yourself opportunities to customize the way you complete tasks so that you feel like it makes better sense to you. And then for our final student, they picked Peppa for the name and Upholder for the tendency, and they wanted more information on pairing. So pairing is tying an undesirable, a task that's hard to do or challenging or less, that you're not motivated to do with something that is easy or something that you really want to do. So you could do pairing as you're allowed to listen to music when you're working on the project and you already know your goals. The team will let you go to the restroom more often after you've completed your section or whatever it is, or go water, or they can assign you free time. So that would be an example of pairing. So if you're going to make this information at least useful at the start, I highly recommend like going through the strategies and visualizing what that could look like, and then modeling a brainstorming conversation about what that could look like for students in the context of the project. And so they would complete that. Another thing where these strategies came in helpful is in the behavior walk. So in our contracts, students can go through steps that can help them untangle their grade from students who are not producing if they've tried very hard to support them and they're still not following through on their agreements. So in my class, the system is we first start with the compassionate check-in. So in a compassionate check-in meeting, I will help them facilitate a meeting where they get to try to learn that student better about what's challenging for them in this project and why it's challenging, so that they have better context. And then given the strategies they like, what are some of the strategies the team and then also the teacher can employ, so that way they can meet that challenge better. The most common challenge I would say that we would meet about is just completing work on time. So depending on whether they were a holder, a questioner, or rebel, or whatever, we would look at the strategies that go with that tendency and try to think of something specific to that student that would help them meet that challenge a little bit better. And then once we were all in agreement, all of us would initial over here. And then let's say we try applying those strategies and the challenge keeps coming up. Then we would fill out another row. But first, before that, I would go back up to these support strategies from our compassionate check-in and say, how are these strategies going? Are you employing them? If a team says, can't give me information about whether or not the strategies are not working because they haven't tried it, then I'll say, try your strategies first before we go to our next step of accountability. Because it's one thing to expect change, but in this tool, students have to show that they're actually trying to support the student in meeting this challenge before they can hold them accountable to the expectation. And so what we'll do is we'll highlight the things that are working and perhaps think of one additional thing they can do if the challenge is still not met, and go from there. One of the things I noticed about this approach to the behavior log is it really created specific strategies for kids about how to be more motivated, and they came up with really creative things. And it also was perceived more positively by students, because then this accountability wasn't so much about consequences and I gotchas. It was more about, we all have challenges, so let's be a little creative about how we support people as they try to work through their own individual challenges. That is where, in order to see more about this contract along with these link resources, once again, you can check out this URL, and I hope that was helpful.